A fist pounded on a metal garage door, once, twice. Then a third time harder, rattling the whole frame. Inside, a big man froze with his hand on the light switch. He wasn't expecting anyone, not at this hour. He pulled the door up a foot, then two, and looked down at a pair of small sneakers. A woman stood there in the cold. Two kids clung to her legs. One duffel bag sat at her feet. Her voice shook when she spoke. "Can we sleep in your garage, just till morning?" The man's name was Roy Delgado, and he had spent 30 years learning to say no. He almost said it now. Then his old dog walked past him, straight to the smallest child, and lay down like he'd guarded that boy 100 times before. Why did that old dog know her? Stay with me on this one. Roy Delgado was 61 years old, and he lived alone at the end of a gravel road on the edge of Cedar Falls, Iowa. 30 years he'd spent walking iron beams 200 feet in the air, bolting the bones of buildings together while the wind tried to peel him off. His knees were shot. His shoulders clicked. He'd buried his wife, Marlene, 4 winters back, and after that he mostly kept to the garage. That garage was his whole world now. A big steel building behind the house, bigger than the house itself. 2 motorcycles under canvas. A workbench worn smooth by his own hands. A wood stove in the corner that he fed all winter long. He wore a patch on his vest that said Iron Saints, and once that had meant riding 200 strong down the highway on a Sunday. Now it mostly meant a handful of gray-bearded men who showed up when somebody needed a roof fixed or a casket carried. People in town had opinions about Roy. Big man, shaved head going gray, tattoos up both forearms, a face that didn't smile much. Kids crossed the street. That was fine by him. He'd stopped needing people a long time ago. He had Diesel, and Diesel was enough. Diesel was a German Shepherd, 10 years old, black and tan gone silver around the muzzle. He limped on cold mornings and slept most of the day by the stove. But that dog had a heart the size of a truck engine, and he was the last living thing on this earth that Roy loved without question. Where Roy went, Diesel went. That was the deal. So when that knock came at 9 o'clock on a raw October night, Roy figured it was trouble, and trouble was the last thing he wanted. He got a good look at them once the door was up. The woman was young, maybe 30, though the tiredness in her face made her look older. Brown hair pulled back rough, a thin jacket that was no match for the wind. And those 2 kids, a girl, maybe 9, with sharp, watchful eyes that had learned to read a room before she stepped into it. And a little boy, 5 or 6, half asleep on his feet, one hand twisted into his mother's sleeve. "Ma'am," Roy said, "it's late." "I know, I'm sorry." The words came fast, like she'd rehearsed them in the dark. "My car died 2 miles back on the county road. I've been walking. The kids can't feel their hands. I saw your light on and I just—" She stopped, swallowed. "I don't have any money. I'm not asking for money. I just need a floor. Concrete's fine. We'll be gone before you're up, I swear it." Roy had heard 100 stories in his life, and half of them were lies. He'd learned to keep his money in his boot and his door shut. He opened his mouth to tell her there was a gas station 4 miles up the road, that they had a phone. That's when Diesel moved. The old dog got up off his blanket, slow, joints cracking, and walked across that whole concrete floor. Roy figured he was heading out to do his business, but Diesel didn't go to the door. He went to the boy. He walked right up to that half-asleep little boy, sniffed him once from his sneakers to his hair, and then something happened that Roy had never seen in 10 years of owning that dog. Diesel let out a low sound, not a growl, something softer. A whine, almost a cry, deep in his chest. And he lay down, right there, pressed against the boy's legs, and put his big gray head across the child's feet like he was settling in for a long watch. The boy didn't flinch. Half asleep as he was, he just sank his little fingers into the dog's fur like he'd done it every night of his life. Roy stood there with his hand still on the door. Now here's the thing about Diesel. That dog did not like strangers. He tolerated the Iron Saints because he'd known them for years. He tolerated the mailmen because he had to. Anyone else, Diesel put himself between them and Roy, hackles up, low warning in his throat. Roy had never once seen him walk up to a stranger and lie down like family. The woman was staring too. Her eyes had gone wide and something moved across her face that Roy couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or the opposite of fear. "He's friendly," Roy heard himself say, which was a lie because Diesel was not friendly and Roy knew it. "He's beautiful," the woman whispered. Her voice cracked on the word. Roy looked at the two kids shivering. He looked at the dog. He thought about Marlene, who would have had them inside and fed before he'd finished being suspicious. He thought about how quiet the garage had been for 4 years. "One night," he said, rougher than he meant. "You sleep by the stove. There's a cot and blankets in the back. I got no food but bread and eggs, and that's for morning. Come sunup, we figure out your car." The girl looked up at him then, and for 1 second the wariness broke and she just looked like a kid. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." Roy pulled the door down against the cold. "Thank the dog." Her name, he learned as he dragged out the cot, was Callie Renner. The girl was Sadie. The little boy, already asleep against Diesel's flank, was Micah. Roy filed the names away and told himself he'd forget them by lunch tomorrow. He wasn't a talker. He got the wood stove roaring, hauled out every blanket he owned, and put a kettle on the hot plate for cocoa, because Marlene had left 3 packets in the cupboard, and it seemed a crime to let kids freeze with cocoa in the house. He watched Callie's hands shake as she wrapped them around the mug. He watched the way she counted her children with her eyes every few seconds, the way a person does when they've been afraid of losing them. And he watched Diesel, who would not leave that boy's side for anything on God's earth. Roy didn't sleep much that night. He sat in his chair with a wool blanket over his knees and pretended to doze. Around midnight the boy cried out in his sleep, one of those small, sharp sounds a child makes when a dream turns bad. Before Callie could stir, Diesel lifted his head and licked the boy's cheek once, twice, until the crying stopped and the little hand found the fur again. Roy leaned forward. In the orange light from the stove, he studied that boy's face. Something about it snagged on him. The shape of the jaw, the dark hair that stood up in a cowlick over the left ear. He had the strangest feeling he'd seen that cowlick before, and it sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't cough up. He told himself he was tired. Old men got sentimental in the dark. He closed his eyes. By the time gray light crept under the garage door, the fire had burned down to coals and the building had gone still and warm. The kids were deep asleep. Callie had finally drifted off in the chair, her head tipped sideways, 4 years of exhaustion catching up all at once. Diesel lay stretched against the boy, rising and falling with the child's breath. Roy stood up slow, his back complaining, and looked at the 3 of them. And for the first time in 4 years, the garage didn't feel empty. It felt full. It felt like something he'd forgotten he wanted. One night, he'd said. Come sunup, they'd sort the car, he'd send them on their way, and his quiet life would close back over the whole thing like water. That was the only plan. He'd make these people some eggs, jump their car, and by 9 o'clock this would all be a story he never told anyone. He almost believed it. Then Diesel got up. The dog rose off the boy so carefully the child never stirred and crossed the floor to the back corner, to the old steel cabinet where Roy kept things he never looked at. And Diesel started to whine, then to scratch, then to bark, sharp and insistent, at a locked metal door he had ignored for 10 straight years. Hey, quiet, Roy hustled over. You'll wake the whole. He stopped, because Diesel was pawing at the bottom drawer, the one Roy hadn't opened since the funeral, the one with Danny's things in it. Roy's whole body went cold. Diesel, his voice had dropped to almost nothing, get away from there. The dog looked back at him and barked again one time, and there was something in those old brown eyes Roy had never seen. Grief. Recognition. The dog was trying to tell him something, and Roy suddenly did not want to know what it was. Behind him, Callie was awake. He heard the chair creak. He turned, and all the color had gone out of her face. She was staring at the cabinet Diesel was scratching like she knew exactly what was inside. "You need to let us leave," Callie said, thin and fast. "Right now, I'll carry Micah. We'll walk. I'm sorry, I should never have." She was already grabbing the duffel bag, already reaching for her sleeping son, her hands frantic. Roy stepped between her and the door without deciding to. "Lady," he said, "how does my dog know you?" She froze. "I've had that dog 10 years, Roy said. "He doesn't walk up to strangers and lie down with them. He doesn't cry over a locked drawer. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want the truth. How does my dog know you?" For a long moment Callie didn't say anything. Micah slept on. Sadie had woken now too, sitting up on the cot, watching her mother with those sharp eyes, and Roy saw the girl's chin tremble like she already knew what was coming. Callie's face crumpled. She sat down hard on the cot, like her legs had quit, and pressed both hands over her mouth. And when she finally spoke, her voice came out in pieces. "His name wasn't always Diesel," she said. "Was it? When he was a puppy, somebody called him Ranger." Roy couldn't breathe. Ranger. That was the name Danny had given him, Danny, Roy's son. Danny had brought that puppy home 14 years ago, a squirming little thing he'd named Ranger, and Roy had grumbled about it, and Danny had laughed and said, "Dad, everybody needs somebody to come home to." Danny had been dead for 10 years. Now, before I tell you what Callie said next, I need you to know something. If this story is already getting to you, if you're feeling that thing in your chest, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it tells me you want more stories like this one. Now stay with me, because this is where it all comes apart. Roy lowered himself onto an overturned crate because he no longer trusted his own legs. "You knew my son," he said. It wasn't a question. Callie nodded. Tears were running down her face, and she wasn't bothering to wipe them. "I loved your son," she said. "More than anything I've ever loved except these 2 kids. And that puppy was ours, mine and Danny's. We raised him together in that little apartment over the tire shop on 4th Street. Danny used to say Ranger was our practice kid." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "When Danny died, I couldn't keep him. I had no money, no place. The vet took him. Said he'd find him a home. I never knew where he went. 10 years I've wondered." Diesel had come back across the floor and pushed his big head into her lap, and Callie bent over him and cried into his fur. And the old dog leaned his whole weight into her like he was trying to hold her up. "He found you," she whispered. "You found me." Roy sat there with his hands hanging between his knees. The pieces were falling, and he could see the shape they were going to make, and he was terrified of it. "Danny died in a car wreck," he said slowly. "On the interstate, 10 years ago this January. He was 23, and I never—" His voice broke and he forced it back. "I never knew he had a girl. He never brought you home." "Why?" Callie looked at him, and there was so much sorrow in that look that Roy felt it land in his own chest like a punch. "Because you two weren't speaking," she said gently. "You'd had that fight, the big one, about him quitting the ironwork and moving to the city. He told me his dad said don't come back till you grow up. He was going to fix it. He kept saying next month, next Christmas, when I've got something to show for myself. He wanted to bring me home when he'd made you proud." She wiped her face. "And then there wasn't any next month." Roy closed his eyes. God help him, he remembered every word of that fight. He'd been so sure he was right. So sure there'd be time. "There's more," Callie said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you throw us out, because I don't have the courage to say it twice." Roy opened his eyes. Callie looked over at the boy sleeping on the floor, that little boy with the dark cowlick over his left ear, and she said, "When Danny died, I was 7 weeks pregnant. He never knew. I didn't even know for sure yet." She took a shaking breath. "Micah is Danny's son. Micah is your grandson, Mr. Delgado. He's got Danny's cowlick and Danny's laugh, and he asks about his daddy every single night. And I never had a good answer, because the only family he had left was a man I was too scared to ever knock on." The whole world went quiet. Roy Delgado had stood on steel beams in hurricane wind. He'd carried his wife's coffin. He'd buried his only son. He'd thought there was nothing left in this life that could knock him flat. He was wrong. He looked at that sleeping boy, and now that he knew, he couldn't unsee it. The jaw, the cowlick, the way the kid slept with one arm flung over his head, exactly the way Danny had slept as a baby, the way Roy had stood in a doorway 30 years ago and watched his son sleep and felt his heart nearly burst. His grandson, his son's son, asleep on his concrete floor, wrapped up in his dead son's dog. "Why now?" Roy managed. 10 years, why tonight?" Callie's face went to shame, deep and old. "Because I ran out of everywhere else." The words came slow and heavy. "There was a man after Danny. I was alone and broke and scared, and he seemed safe at first. They always do. Sadie's father." She glanced at her daughter, and Sadie looked down at her hands. "He wasn't safe. 2 nights ago he put his hand around my throat in our own kitchen with the kids watching, and I finally understood he was going to kill me in front of them, and soon." Roy's hands closed into fists on his knees. "So I took what I could carry and I put my kids in the car and I drove," Callie said. "I didn't have a plan. I just drove east, away from him, and somewhere around Waterloo I realized I was heading here, to Cedar Falls, to the town Danny always talked about. I had this old photo of your house. Danny kept it in his wallet. I've carried it 10 years. She pulled a scrap of a photograph from the duffel, cracked white down the middle, and Roy saw his own porch, his own maple tree, younger. "I told myself I'd just drive past and look at where he grew up. I never meant to knock. I swear I never meant to be a burden on a man who doesn't even know me." "So what happened?" Roy said. "The car died." Callie let out that broken laugh again. 2 miles from your house in the cold, with no money and nowhere left on the entire earth to go. I walked toward the only light I could see." She looked down at Diesel, and fresh tears spilled over. "And it was yours, and the dog we raised was lying by your fire. What are the odds, Mr. Delgado? What are the odds?" Roy didn't have an answer. He'd stopped believing in odds a long time ago. But he looked at that old dog, the dog his son had named Ranger, the dog who had walked across the whole garage last night and lain down with a child he'd never met and cried like his heart was breaking. And Roy understood something. Diesel had known. He'd smelled Danny in that little boy's blood. 10 years gone, and that faithful old animal had recognized the woman he'd been a puppy with, and the child who carried his boy's scent, and he had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had stood guard. He had said, in the only language he had, "These ones are ours." He wasn't just being friendly, Roy said, his voice thick. "Last night, when he lay down with the boy." "No," Callie whispered, "he knew." Roy stood. He walked past the wood stove to the steel cabinet Diesel had been scratching at. His hands shook as he worked the key off his ring. He hadn't opened this drawer since the day of the funeral. He'd told himself he'd get to it someday. He'd told himself a lot of things. The drawer slid open. Inside were the last things of Danny's Roy had kept. A folded flannel shirt, red and black, still faintly holding a smell Roy could not let himself breathe in too deep. A worn leather wallet. A little league trophy. And a leash. An old blue nylon leash with the metal clasp gone dull, the one Danny used to walk a puppy named Ranger. Roy took out the leash and turned around. And Diesel, seeing it, let out a bark that echoed off the steel walls, and his whole back end started wagging like he was a puppy again, like 10 years had fallen off him all at once. The dog remembered. Of course he did. That was the moment Micah woke up. The little boy sat up, rubbing his eyes, looked around at the strange, bright garage, at his crying mother, at the huge tattooed stranger holding an old blue leash. And instead of being scared, Micah looked at Diesel, and his whole small face lit up. "Is that my dog?" Micah asked, simple as anything, the way only a child can ask the exact right question. Roy Delgado, who had not cried at his own son's funeral because he'd been too busy holding everyone else up, who had not cried when they lowered Marlene into the ground beside their boy, felt his face come apart. He knelt down on his bad knees on that cold concrete, right in front of his grandson, and the tears came and he let them. "Yeah, buddy," Roy said, "that's your dog. His name is Diesel. But a long time ago, before you were even born, your daddy named him Ranger." Micah's eyes went wide. "You knew my daddy?" "I did." Roy had to stop and breathe. "I knew him better than anybody. Your daddy was my son." The boy considered this with the serious frown of a 5-year-old working out something enormous. Then he crawled off the cot, stood in front of Roy, and put one small hand on the old man's rough cheek, right where the tears ran down into his gray stubble. "Then you're my grandpa," Micah said. And Roy, who had learned 30 years ago how to say no, who had built a wall around his heart brick by brick and lived behind it alone with his dog and his grief, found there was only one word left in him. "Yeah," he said, and pulled that little boy into his chest and held on. "Yeah, I am. I'm your grandpa, and I am so sorry it took me this long to find you." Sadie was crying on the cot. Callie had both hands over her face. And Diesel pushed his way into the middle of it all, in among the arms and the tears, licking whatever he could reach, tail going like a metronome, because his family was together again, and that was the only thing a good dog ever wants. They didn't sleep any more that morning. Roy made eggs. A lot of eggs, more than that hot plate had ever seen, and toast burned a little because he kept getting distracted looking at the boy, and he found an ancient jar of grape jelly, and Micah declared it the best breakfast in the history of breakfasts. Sadie ate 3 pieces of toast, and slowly the wariness in her eyes began to thaw. Roy made sure to give her the first plate. He had a feeling that girl had spent her whole young life watching to see if the grown-ups would take care of her, and he wanted her to see the answer was going to be yes from now on, every single time. Callie told him about Danny, filled in 10 missing years, the good ones and the hard ones. She told him how, underneath the anger of that last fight, there had never once been anything but love. "He was going to call you," Callie said. "That week, he decided. He was going to tell you about me and ask if he could come home. He just ran out of time." Roy took that and held it, the pain and the grace of it all mixed together, and found he could carry it. It was easier than the not knowing had been. The man Callie had run from had a name and a temper and a history, and Roy made 2 phone calls before lunch. The first was to a lawyer the Iron Saints kept on retainer. The second was to a brother in the club who happened to be a county sheriff's deputy. Roy explained the situation in a low, even voice, and by that afternoon there were papers moving and a protection order in the works, and a quiet understanding passed among certain men in Cedar Falls that Callie Renner and her children now had people. That she would not be handling any of it alone, not ever again. The car was a lost cause. One look under the hood told Roy the engine was gone for good. He didn't say a word about the money. He just towed it back, parked it beside his motorcycles, and said, "We'll figure you out something that runs." He noticed he'd said we. He didn't take it back. That first night, Callie tried to talk about leaving, about not wanting to impose, about finding a shelter. Roy stopped her with one raised hand. "Let me tell you how this is going to go," he he said, gentle but with iron under it, the same iron that had walked steel beams in the wind. "This is your son's house. He grew up in it. His room is at the top of the stairs, and it's been sitting empty for 10 years waiting for somebody, and I think we both know who." He looked at her steady. "You and those kids are not a burden, Callie. You're the family I thought I lost. You're the only piece of my boy I've got left walking around on this earth. So you're not sleeping in any shelter. You're home. You've been trying to get home for 10 years and you finally made it. Let yourself be home." Callie put her face in her hands and cried, and this time it wasn't the crying of a woman who was scared. It was the crying of somebody setting down a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Micah moved into Danny's old room. Roy spent a whole Saturday cleaning it out and found himself telling stories the entire time. "This is your dad's baseball glove. These are the height marks on the door frame, look here. This is him at your age." The boy drank in every word like a kid who'd been thirsty his whole life. Sadie got the guest room and, more importantly, a lock on the inside of her door that only she controlled, because Roy understood without being told that a child who'd lived in fear needs to know she can shut the world out. Within a month she stopped using it. That was how Roy knew it was working. And Diesel, old, gray-muzzled, limping Diesel, got a second wind that the vet couldn't explain, and Roy didn't try to. That dog followed Micah everywhere. Slept at the foot of his bed every night, right where he'd slept at the foot of Danny's bed a lifetime ago. When Micah started kindergarten in the spring, Diesel walked him to the end of the driveway every morning and was waiting at that same spot every afternoon, and Roy would stand on the porch and feel his son standing right there beside him, closer than he'd felt him in 10 years. Sometimes in the evenings Roy would sit in his chair by the wood stove, the same chair he'd sat in the night they came, and look around at the noise and the life filling up his once silent garage. Callie at the workbench, studying for her nursing certificate, Sadie reading in the corner. Micah stretched out on the floor with his arms around a dog who had crossed an entire lifetime to find him, and Roy would think about the man he'd been that first cold night, the man who almost said no. He'd almost said no. That was the thing that kept him up sometimes. He'd come that close to sending them back into the dark. If Diesel hadn't stood up, if that faithful old dog hadn't remembered a scent from 10 years and 2 lifetimes ago and walked across the floor to lie down with a grandson Roy didn't know he had. But you know what Roy decided in the end? He decided it wasn't chance. A dead man's dog does not walk up to a stranger's child and stand guard by accident. Roy wasn't a church-going man, not really, but he came to believe his boy had a hand in it somehow. That Danny, wherever he was, had pointed his family down a dark county road toward the only light for miles, and had whispered to an old dog by the fire, "That one boy, that's the one, go on now, bring them home." The knock that started it all had almost been a door closing. Instead it became a door opening, and it stayed open. Roy had the big garage door fixed so it never stuck again, and most days now it stood up and open, letting the light in, because there was always somebody coming or going, always a kid running through, always that old dog lying in the sun across the threshold, keeping watch. A woman and 2 children had knocked in the dark and asked to sleep on a cold concrete floor. And a hard old man had almost turned them away. But love has a long memory, longer than grief, longer than pride, longer even than 10 years of silence. Sometimes it wears an old dog's gray face, and it remembers you when you've forgotten yourself, and it lies down at your feet and refuses to leave until you finally come home.